Now hold on, before you click off the video because this isn't SnowRunner, may I present a Gaz-66 that I'm using as a radio station to crush religious sympathy and spread Soviet propaganda, and a Kraz-6322 that I'm using as a TV station to do the same thing. Somehow. This is Workers and Resources Soviet Republic, my new addiction and favorite city building game I think of all time. In this video, I want to talk about my latest hyperfixation with you, in the same way I do in my SnowRunner videos. Trolleybuses, or trolley mechanisms? But to understand where this hyperfixation came from, you need to have a small understanding of workers and resources. Because at first, it's really hard to justify implementing trolleybus infrastructure into your cities when you understand how this game works. You see, in workers and resources, you don't simply place a house. I mean, you can, but whenever you just outright pay for construction, you're paying roughly 1.5 times more than if you sourced and constructed the building yourself. And when your country was at one point so poor that exporting train cars full of gravel worth about as much as the latest Taco Bell box was stopping you from going bankrupt and exiled to the gulag, you learn that every ruble counts. When you place a building, your construction offices will send out a fleet of machines to bring all the gravel, concrete, asphalt, boards, steel, bricks, glorious commie block prefab panels, electrical and mechanical components, as well as workers to slowly build your buildings piece by piece. Every building is broken down like this, so every material you make yourself will literally save you millions. But we're not running a gulag, don't look at my uranium mine, we're running a country. And your citizens will need food, meat, clothes, alcohol, gaming PCs, places to spend their free time, places to exercise their little profit-generating bodies, places to store their garbage, power, drinking water, heat, because central heating is a foreign concept, places to get smarter, flags with anime fox girls, and statues of Lenin to enforce their undying loyalty to your glorious government. And that's not even all. A big reason this game appeals so much to my autistic little brain is that it's very vehicle-focused, because all those resources you're buying or generating don't move around on their own. Every vehicle needs fuel. Every vehicle will break down and need to be repaired. Every cargo type needs a different truck, or train, or plane, or boat. It's complicated, insomnia-inducing, and it's the only game that's ever had me looking up real-world distribution chains and drawing railway line diagrams in my free time and still coming up with shit that looks like this. But with over like 3,000 different vehicle mods on the Steam Workshop, this game becomes the perfect mesh of my love for city building games and my love for obscure Russian vehicles. Yes, my secret police are driving T-34s. In what other city builder can you buy a Maz 537? Welcome to Gary, Indiana, Estonia. A bustling, nearly self-sufficient steel town. Come see our lovely attractions such as Victory Park, the Junkyard, our garbage ocean consisting of imported toxic waste, this airport designed by a simpleton, or the Powerline Forest. Our public transport relies entirely on trolleybuses that we manufacture ourselves, with the exception of a few personal cars for the loyal elite. We even have a trolley vodka delivery truck. Think of the busiest commuter road in the city that you live in. Are there power poles next to it? Congrats, your town has everything it needs for trolleybus infrastructure. Trolleybuses, or trackless trams as they're sometimes called, are electric buses that run by having 2 poles sticking out of the roof, making contact with 2 electric wires suspended above the roadway, creating a 600 to 750 volt current that then powers the bus's electric motors. These caught my eye in particular because it just doesn't make a ton of sense to implement them in workers and resources, and started my downward spiral into the rabbit hole that is trolleybuses and understanding the thought processes behind different kinds of public transport. So as I said, in workers and resources, every resource counts. When building your road network, dirt roads are free, but slow. If you upgrade them to gravel, you have to have dump trucks transport all the gravel and bulldozers to flatten it. If you build a panel road, you need trucks to transport the panels and a crane to lay them down. You get the picture. If you're building trolleybus roads, they can only be built on brick or asphalt, which is expensive, and you need a lot of it for roads, as well as the steel and electrical components for the trolleybus poles and wires. You also need a specific trolleybus depot to house the buses, and you cannot upgrade a regular bus depot. It needs to be a separate building. On top of that, you need a transformer to hook up power to the roads, and to even further complicate their implementation into your city, you need to demolish and rebuild your current bus stops to change them to trolleybus stops, meaning for as long as it takes for you to build new stops and get that system up and running, your public transit system and potentially even your economy grinds to a halt, which is annoying, because in most cases trolleybuses were seen as an interim step between buses and the implementation of full-on trams. But I'll actually start talking about trolleybuses. I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing about workers and resources. The first known trolley vehicle was the Elektromote, designed by Dr. Ernst Werner von Siemens in Berlin in 1882. Yes, that Siemens, the guy who invented the electric train, electric elevator, and is credited with inventing the dynamo. It ran along a 600-yard line powered by a steam engine dynamo he had running in a nearby shed. The carriage itself had two 2.2 kilowatt engines hooked up to a chain drive that could reach 7 miles per hour. Dr. Ernst would only demonstrate the line for about a month and a half before he proved his point and moved on. In 1904, Max Schiemann, another German electric railway and truck engineer, would build a trolleybus with 2 poles contacting overhead wires, standardizing the current collection system that would go on to be how most trolleybus systems would run from there on. The use of trolleybus systems became common during the electric rail boom after World War I. Since trolleybuses run on the same basic system as electric rails and trams, it was easy to effectively extend tram lines with the trolleys to cover areas that needed public transportation but couldn't be justified in installing expensive rails and signals. These systems saw widespread use in tons of European countries, and there were even a small number of lines running in the United States in the early 1900s. But I'm going to focus on one country in particular, the pioneer of widespread trolleybus infrastructure in the Eastern Bloc. You guessed it, Russia. The first Soviet trolleybus was made in 1933, the LK-1, named after Lazar Kaganovich, a high-ranking government official that would go on to be the People's Commissar of Railways, Heavy Industry, Oil, and would be the man leading the reconstruction of Moscow. There were 65 LK-1s built from 1933 to 1936, and it was described as being a dangerous and unreliable bus. It had a 60 kilowatt motor, a wooden frame with a metal body, hydraulic brakes on the rear only, no heat, no wipers, no power steering, and the cabin would leak water consistently, which is, well, it's not what you want on an electric vehicle connected to live wires. They were difficult to operate, uncomfortable, and broke down constantly. They were officially decommissioned in 1937 after one burst a tire and fell into the Fontanka River, killing 13 passengers. So while the trolleybus was seen as an acceptable form of transportation at the time, they didn't necessarily instill the people's confidence. Not that they had much of a choice. Thanks to some mods, I actually have 2 LKs in my city. They're faster than the real-world counterpart, being able to hit 34 miles per hour instead of the barely 20 the real LK could hit, and carry 55 passengers, just like the real one. Thankfully, your citizens' happiness isn't affected by how crappy of a vehicle you put them in. Also, not to minimize the tragedy of the 13 lives that were cut short, but can you imagine just how unwieldy a vehicle this thing must have been if bursting a tire at school zone speed was enough for it to go careening into a river? Anyway, in 1935, Russia only had 61 trolleybuses working 22 kilometers of routes. By the end of that same year, Nikita Khrushchev demanded 250 more to work an additional 52 kilometers. Enter the Yaroslavl Automotive Plant, or YAG, to build the YaTB-1. Keep in mind, Russia was still developing. They were developing rapidly, but still. At the time of this order, the Yaroslavl Automotive Plant they designated to build these buses was nothing more than a construction school converted into a makeshift factory. The frame was built in the locker room. The pneumatic brakes were stored in the red corner, part of the school reserved for religious communist events, and the body was stored outside under a canopy. There was absolutely no way the Yaroslavl plant was going to be able to mass-produce buses like this. YAG had large-scale factories. They produced trucks in massive quantities in the early days of Russia, such as the YAG-10, which are part of the Workers and Resources Early Start DLC. But as much as government officials wanted them to build buses, they wanted them to retain their resources for truck production. As such, the trolleybus plant had to subcontract a lot of its parts and development to other factories. ZiS, current-day ZiL, actually played a huge role in the production, research, and development of this bus. Which, can I just say, the reason I vastly prefer researching Soviet vehicles is there's just so much more information once you find it. The wiki page of the Oshkosh M1120 that I talked about in my last video pales in comparison to the YaTB-1's page. Like, I can even tell you that they sourced the wood for the frame from the Odessa forest. Does anyone care about that? No, but like, what the hell? Even with Gaz providing the wheels and ZiS providing the rear axles, the first YaTB-1 didn't hit the streets until 1936, nearly 6 months after the deadline of Nikita saying he wanted 250 made. YAG ramped up production quickly, by the end of that year hitting 119 total trolleybuses made. Production of the YaTB continued until 1941, where they produced 922 buses in total. The YaTB-1 was a massive improvement over the comparably terrifying LK-1. While it didn't have power steering or shock absorbers on the leaf springs, the TB had soft seats, heat, pneumatic brakes, wipers, and doors, and a tire pressure system, as well as interior lighting and the ability for the driver to switch to reverse from the driver's seat instead of getting out and switching the electric motor to reverse. It was very advanced for its time, being the first Soviet road vehicle to use air brakes and pneumatics for the doors. It also introduced regenerative braking to Russia's trolleybus lines. Being as these buses didn't have batteries, it actually means that buses using regenerative braking were powering other buses on the line, which is really cool to think about for 1930s tech. While the YaTB was a massive improvement over the LK-1, it wasn't without its flaws. Being as the production was handled by so many different plants, the parts didn't exactly fit perfectly. It was common for the worm gear on the rear-mounted transmission to shear off, destroying the axles, drive shafts, and some cases, just like the ZiU-150, that now destroyed spinning drive shaft would tear up the brake lines, giving the driver no way to slow the bus down. There were 113 documented cases of gearbox failure on these buses. That's 12% of the fleet. The wooden bodies and frames rotted exceptionally quickly, and just like the LK-1, the electrical compartment would take on moisture and severely limit the bus's ability to operate. If that wasn't bad enough, it was nearly impossible to get one of these buses to accelerate past 25 miles per hour, as the rollers attached to the lines had trouble making contact and were extremely weak, having a lifespan of about 8 to 10 days, until a better design was used about a year later. The Yaroslavl plant did try to improve on its design the best they could. The YaTB2 and TB4s were mildly modified models with the goal of reducing weight and increasing top speed. But the TB3 is where things get even more sketchy. Take the base TB1, now put another one on top of it. It was inspired by an AEC 644T, and the Yaroslavl plant thought they could wow Russian officials by building one of their own. While it was given a metal body and tandem rear axles, it retained all the faults of the previous models and was just generally seen as kind of a gimmick. It was heavy, not well suited for rough Russian roads, couldn't go everywhere on a route due to the higher roofline being too short for some of the network, and due to only having one door and a passenger capacity of 100 people, made loading and unloading exceptionally slow. But you were allowed to smoke on the second floor. So, that's cool. They only made 10 double-decker buses, and none have survived to this day. It was impossible to transport them on railcar when Moscow was evacuated at the start of World War II, so they were left to be destroyed. It's a miracle any of the YaTB buses survived at all. In the early 40s, some of the worn-out buses were lucky enough to be restored at the Toshino aircraft plant, but the unlucky ones got sent to Kharkov and had their seats thrown out and converted to cargo vehicles. Desperate times of World War II led to drastic and unusual measures. They would use them to transport firewood, food, and in one instance, cut off a passenger compartment completely to make room for artillery transport. I was able to find quite a few pictures of these, but they're not very high quality. Sorry about that. Buses weren't the only thing the Russians converted into trolley transport. There's a famous picture of a MAZ 525 dump truck with trolley cables and two 172 kilowatt motors that was used in quarries to offset the consumption of diesel. Trolley trucks were actually fairly common during wartime. Much cheaper to run than trucks that required fuel, and running along trolleybus routes that were connected between civilian hubs and workplaces anyway just kind of makes a weird kind of sense when you think about it. There's still some out there in the wild, usually used as trolley tow trucks and service vehicles, as well as extremely niche delivery trucks. You can get cargo trolley vehicles in Workers and Resources with mods, but they require their own electrified loading and unloading stations, so they require a lot of infrastructure to support them, and they can't use distribution offices. I have a cargo truck running, transporting beer of all things, but it's more of a gimmick than anything else. There are exactly 2 YaTB buses still around today, but for a while, they were thought long gone. As the buses broke down, they were either restored at Tushino or left to rot. It wasn't uncommon to see struggling citizens scavenge them, and there were a few reports of the bodies being repurposed for sheds or even makeshift cabins. It wasn't until 1996 that a complete YaTB-1 was found in the backyard of a cottage in Gorkovsky near Leningrad. Bus number 44. The bus was reclaimed and restored to a functional state, and is on display at the St. Petersburg Museum of Urban Electric Transport, and even takes part in an odd parade or two here and there. You are able to get the YaTB buses in Workers and Resources again thanks to some mods, even the double-decker ones, having a lore-accurate top speed of 33 miles an hour and being able to carry 100 people. I don't really use them because, just like the Russians, I think double-deckers are stupid and ugly. Later on, when the Soviets would want more capacity, they would move to trailer or articulated buses. During World War II, Russia's main bus fleet had been sent to the front lines to move personnel and serve as ambulances. What buses did remain in cities like Kiev and Leningrad had their fuel supply dry up quickly. Thankfully, they had managed to evacuate enough trolleybuses and even some electrical equipment out of Moscow to help fill the gaps by running on already existing tram lines, and building new contact networks for the trolleybuses to cover dead spots. Seeing how well supplemental trolleybuses functioned, how quickly the infrastructure to support them could be added to extend the line, and how they were much cheaper to run than diesel or gasoline buses, their implementation exploded after the war. Enter the MTB82, a bus that would become the embodiment of Soviet trolleybus design across the Eastern Bloc all the way until the 60s. As the war reached an end, the multitude of cities that had opened transport networks were in desperate need for vehicles. The government assigned Zavod Plant Number 82, a plant that had been building aircraft for the Russian army, to start work on the next generation of trolleybuses for Soviet transport companies. Hence the name, MTB, Moscow Trolleybus, 82, named after the plant. While the Lend-Lease Act helped educate Soviet engineers with a more Western way of building, as the GMC TDH-5101 was what the MTB is supposedly modeled after, the Soviet Union wanted as many buses as possible, and they wanted them now. So the first models of the MTB82 were built on a prototype chassis of the YaTB-5 that had been developed before the war, retaining much of the outdated tech of the old buses, but kept the incredibly heavy metal body, which engineers and drivers complained that the 74 kilowatt motor was far too underpowered and unwieldy to drive. You know who the lead designer of the MTB82 was? Naum Chernyakov, the same guy who would go on to design the T-4 supersonic bomber. Yeah, that's okay. In 1945, the bus was finally given its own custom-made frame, and the body out of significantly more aluminum, only keeping the driver compartment steel. The Zavod plant actually produced bodies at such a rapid rate that there weren't enough frames, so to keep the factory workers employed, the bodies were adapted to the MTB82 tram. I'm not gonna go down the rabbit hole of trams, I just wanted to bring that up. As tensions in relations between former allies grew, the Soviets decided that Zavod Plant 82 would return to producing military aircraft and rockets. The production of the MTB82 was passed on to the ZiU plant in 1951. ZiU changed nothing about the MTB to keep production flowing, only changing the front emblem to a red star. The MTB82 was regarded as being a massive improvement over the YaTB models by both passengers, operators, and mechanics alike. It still had its faults, mostly due to its outdated and wildly inefficient electrical equipment and lack of low-voltage circuits to the auxiliary components, meaning that the operator had to be highly trained in using the equipment properly and recognizing if something was wearing out to avoid getting shocked or a fire. It had an 11-speed manual gearbox with very specific thresholds for each gear to avoid wearing out the motor. It didn't have power steering, which made driving it exhausting, and the heater wasn't nearly powerful enough for the size of the cabin, often being unable to defrost the windshield on the coldest days. Peering through a small slit in the windshield, drivers often compared it to driving a tank, but it still had plenty of advancements, many in the ways of safety. It had interior lighting, volt and amp meters for the driver, an emergency stop from the passenger compartment, check-in pressure relief valves on the air system, and an emergency battery to keep the radio and heater running in the event of a power outage. Their production officially ended in 1960, where an estimated 5,000 in total were built between both factories, running everywhere from the capital to small villages of just a few thousand people. It was a symbol of Soviet public transport, the poster child even. Because of their durable design, ease of maintenance, and mass production, many of them remained in service until the early 70s. But this was partially because some cities just didn't have maintenance depots large enough to handle the next generation of high-capacity buses. The MTBs weren't simply left to rot like the YAG trolleybuses. Quite a few of them are still running and in the hands of museums, and just like the YAG trolleybuses, take part in parades. Several of them are on display as monuments to Soviet technical advancements. MTBs are actually the bread and butter of the automotive plant in my fictional republic. They either get put to work in the cities or get loaded onto a MAZ 537 to get hauled to the port to spread Moscow trolleybus glory to the rest of the Eastern Bloc. But it's 1961. It's time to switch production to the replacement for the MTB82, the ZiU-5. The ZiU-5 was arguably more iconic than the MTB82 and saw significant widespread use and much larger production numbers, reaching roughly 16,000. And can I just say, this is a good looking bus. I can't explain it, but round buses, they do something to me, man. I love them. By 1960, the MTB82 was completely outdated. Its electrics were archaic and dangerous. It was slow, heavy, and compared to the development of internal combustion engine buses, it was seen as a medium-capacity bus with how few people it could carry. The ZiU-5 aimed to solve all of these problems, focusing significantly more on drivability and passenger comfort, which, wasn't something that was often considered in Soviet vehicles. It has much safer and modern electrical controls, and a lot of components that were pneumatic in previous buses were now electric, such as the door controls. It had an all-aluminum body and a 2-speed gearbox, which made it almost peppy and easy to drive. The bus was wide, which gave passengers much more room, and so were the doors, which made loading luggage much easier compared to the MTB's incredibly narrow doors. But Soviet's gonna Soviet, cut corners to maximize production. It had a cloud of carelessness hanging over its production. Parts often didn't fit right. What were supposed to be innovative technologies were more often headaches with how haphazardly they were designed and constructed, and the buses would clog up service depots. In just a few short years after their production, it had fallen out of the good graces of the people and operators, and was no longer seen as a modern bus. Even though ZiU stopped producing them in 1972, many ZiU-5s continued on busing until around 1987, where they were officially pulled off routes. Except for Leningrad, for some reason. They kept using them all the way up until 1993. Being a more recent bus, plenty of surviving copies still exist as museum pieces in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and many other places around the Eastern Bloc. I could go on to talk about the trolleybuses that followed, the ZiU-9, the Skoda 14TR, the LAZ 695. That's not even a trolleybus, that's just a good-looking bus. Hell, even MAZ makes trolleybuses. But I was more interested in the historical side of this tech, how it came to be, what made it viable. It's an interesting hole to go down, and learning about the buses that pioneered this tech is something I would have never done without workers and resources. So, thanks for that, game. Trolleybus tech is still around, but it's not nearly as popular. Innovations in electric buses is the main reason. There was a brief period before full-on battery power where different manufacturers had trolleybuses with short-life batteries, allowing them to power themselves for a few miles off the line. But as EV tech boomed, most modern economies have opted for battery buses, having the driver return to the depot to charge the bus and swapping it for a fully charged one. Germany actually experimented with the idea of trolley trucks again, electrifying a small part of the Autobahn to both power and charge trucks as they drive along. But again, with the advancements in EV technology, it just makes more sense to have dedicated EV charging stations at truck stops. Not only that, but with the high volume of traffic these lines were expected to receive, they would require significant maintenance. Only about 400 lines remain in operation across the globe, mostly in metropolitan areas alongside trams. There are 4 active in America: Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle, and Dayton, Ohio. Ohio, what the hell? There's a collection of about 20 historic trolleybuses on display at the Illinois Railway Museum, which I might actually go check out one of these days. Trolleybus tech is just one of those models of transport we might see slowly start to disappear as EVs become more accessible and cheaper. A cool and interesting part of transport history. I hope I get to ride one someday. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate it if you watched all the way through. I know this is really out of left field compared to my SnowRunner content, but hey, I just like things with wheels. I'd also appreciate if you could give this video a like to push trolleybus propaganda to more people. And maybe even join the Discord to talk all things mechanisms and play games with like-minded people. And hey, if you want to see more workers and resources, let me know. I love this game. Double thank you so much to all my supporters that I completely forgot to mention in the dairy video because I was just rushing to finish it. I'm really sorry about that. But thank you again, and I'll see you all in the next video.